Good morning and welcome to Frameworks, but I'm not building a house. My attempt at being cute about the topic of theoretical and conceptual frameworks in research studies. I'm Paula DeWitowitz. I am the research coordinator for the Walden University School of Education and Professional Licensure, and I'm going to do your presentation today. So let's begin. During this presentation, we're going to talk about the meaning of frameworks, the epistemology related to research studies and why they are important to understanding which framework to use and the purpose of frameworks. And then we're going to look at theoretical and conceptual frameworks one by one, including some examples of each so that you can understand a little bit better, perhaps, what they really look like and how you put them together. Finally, something not listed here, I'm going to give you a list of references and then some examples of articles that use frameworks that might be useful to you. And what I will do for those is simply put the titles of the articles on the screen, each separately for each of the screen, the slides for a few seconds. You can always pause the recording and look at those, write them down, and take a look at them to see what the frameworks look like. I will tell you right now, I do not guarantee that the rest of the articles or the materials are really strong, but the frameworks themselves can give you an idea of what a framework might look like. The first thing I want to talk about is the fact that the terms related to frameworks have become kind of loosey-goosey in the research environment today. What do I mean by that? People will talk about theoretical frameworks and conceptual frameworks as though they're the same thing or they can be used in any kind of situation. People are not really clear about what the differences are between the two frameworks. And that's important to understand because what you want when you finish your degree, when you go out and do research in the world, is to be recognized as being someone who is specific, succinct, exacting about your research, about how you conceptualize it, how you justify it, and how you conduct it and draw conclusions from it, because those are the people who do research with distinction and whose work is invariably trusted more than people who are loosey-goosey. So I'm going to explain to you the reasons that you don't want to be loosey-goosey and how you can prevent that when you go out and conduct research. I will also tell you, though, that you will see the terms theoretical framework and conceptual framework used in a loosey-goosey manner inappropriately. Please do not use the research articles that vary from the actual appropriate use of those terms and those designs. Please don't copy them because it's not going to be useful to you. It's going to ultimately be harmful to your reputation as a researcher. So we use those definitions as those terms classically. We recognize that they have a specific meaning, they have a specific use, and we also expect you to use them appropriately in dissertations and look for that, those characteristics, that recognition. So your dissertation must adhere to the actual specific standards that are used in classical and traditional research so that we know that you understand the difference between these terms. Okay, the purpose of a framework is really clear, no matter what kind of framework you're using, what kind of study you're doing. And it is discussed in the section on structures of the study, page 11, and in the book that is used in the first research course now, written by Burkholder, Cox, and Crawford. So if you have any questions about it, that is one source that you can use. But I will say now that the purpose of a framework, whether you use any kind of study or are putting together any kind of research plan, is really to identify the reason or the focus of the study and to clarify the approach that you're going to use in the study. And that becomes extremely important for a couple of reasons. If you don't have the appropriate framework or a framework at all, then what you end up with is a study that is scattered. It doesn't have a direct focus. It's not really clear what you're trying to find out, or the structure doesn't make sense. So you might have a purpose that's looking at something that would be appropriate for a case study, and you're conducting another kind of study. The structure will not align correctly. Remember that the framework helps us to understand the bridge between your problem, your research purpose, and your research questions and design. That's one of its main purposes. So if you don't have that, your structure could be unclear, your alignment could be off. Your purpose may not be supported, or your approach may not be supported as a result, because as a part of that framework, that structure that creates the alignment, if you want to think of it, that piece of the bridge from research problem to research design is missing if you don't have your framework. So you can drive your car down the alignment bridge and suddenly fall in the ocean, if you want to think of this as a graphic picture. So frameworks are very, very important. So let's talk about why and how you decide on them. The basis of frameworks can be best understood in the context of epistemology. This is a word that we don't use a lot in research anymore, simply because epistemology was the way that we recognize acceptable conclusions people could draw from research. Now, that's not the classic definition. I'm not reading from a text, but that's essentially what it meant. The way that we decide what our acceptable conclusions are, or the acceptable conclusions we believe you can draw from a type of research. It was essentially a philosophical approach to research. From it, first, came positivism, the idea of absolutes, the basis for quantitative research, the idea that you could test to see if something was absolutely confirmed, absolutely disconfirmed, using statistical analysis. So that is quantitative positivism. After a period of time, post-positivism developed. That was basically starting with qualitative research, the idea that things could not be absolute because people experience life differently, they have different attitudes, experiences, and behaviors, and all of those things result in non-quantifiable kinds of situations where absolutes could not be determined. So post-positivism is a rejection of the idea that you can have yes and no, absolute kinds of conclusions drawn from research. Now, those two different epistemologies, those two different ways of thinking of things got even more complicated when quantitative researchers decided that they liked the idea of post-positivism, but they weren't willing to do quite as much with it as qualitative researchers. So they decided that post-positivism for them meant that you could draw absolutes, you could draw a conclusion about something being confirmed or not confirmed for a specific location, but not for, let's say, all third grade students across the United States or all third grade students in general. So they became a limited application of post-positivism. However, the underlying epistemologies, the idea of absolutism or the idea of testing absolutism to see if it is confirmed or not, and the idea of examining something from a more humanist perspective that gives you more variability and a more rounded approach to a topic are what we really need to focus on to understand how we align and how apply each of the frameworks, the kinds of methods that we're using. Okay, so a sample qualitative or mixed method epistemology focused on philosophy could be any of these. Feminism, which focuses on the idea that feminist voices are not heard as much as they need to. Semantic theory, the social approach. Classical pragmatism, which also is the undergirding for much of the philosophy of mixed methods. Phenomenology, which can be looked at in several different ways. Hermeneutics, structuralism, post-structuralism, Marxism, nihilism. All of these have different applications and different approaches applied. So essentially, when you are looking at a philosophy for qualitative research, you have a number of different ways that you can approach a study. That will become important when we talk a little bit more about qualitative studies and the kind of framework you use with those in just a minute. But I also want to point something else out. Rather than just a philosophical bent for a qualitative kind of study, there are things like experiential, presentational, propositional, and practical approaches that are part at times of a framework. These are based on the idea, as you read about them a little more if you're curious, that people, through experience, through exposure, have a specific approach to life, that they're impacted in specific ways, or ways that we don't necessarily define as being absolute, but ways that are specific to them. So there's a philosophical approach and an experiential approach, if you want to think of it that way, to the nature of qualitative research. Why is that important? We're getting there. It is important, however, to recognize that even though this is how research design evolved, that we had a quantitative or a positivist approach that said we can identify absolutes, and a qualitative approach that said we don't live in a world of absolutes and we have variations, an epistemology that was post-positivist. We don't make those kinds of decisions for our research anymore. That is not the basis of the way that we approach research. We choose our study design based on, instead, the questions that we have. What are our research questions? What is our gap? What are we going to look at as a part of that gap for our purpose? And that defines what kind of design we're going to use, what kind of research questions we have, and in turn, which epistemological camp we will fall into. Now, when I start to talk about epistemological camps, it's time at this point to talk about the two different camps you might see. So one is theoretical, which deals with quantitative research, and the other is conceptual, which deals with qualitative or mixed methods research. Quantitative is the positivist approach. So everything dealing with a quantitative design is going to fit that kind of positivist epistemology. So you'll have a theoretical framework. You'll be testing a theory or a hypothesis. You'll be determining the relationships between two or more variables. Is there a significant relationship statistically, or is there not a significant relationship statistically? Is there a significant change statistically, or is there not a significant change statistically? That's what you'll be looking at. You'll be examining yes or no questions to identify what that relationship is. And you'll use numbers that are analyzed statistically in order to determine the nature of that relationship, whether there is or is not a statistically significant change, difference, relationship, that kind of thing. So you're going to use things like test scores, surveys, instruments, anything that will yield you numerical data that you can analyze. A conceptual framework aligns with the post-positivist epistemology, okay, as used by qualitative researchers and mixed methods researchers. It creates a lens or an approach for your study. Your study will be exploratory or explanatory related to a topic or a phenomenon. So, and we don't talk about variables, we talk about factors, and you can have multiple factors instead of just the 2 variable or potentially 3, 4 variable model. You're going to have a number of factors that deal with your specific phenomenon, because you're looking at it from a more holistic approach than you are in the laser straight approach that you use the theoretical framework. So you're going to have an exploratory or explanatory kind of study using a lens, framework as a lens or an approach for your study. You're not going to ask just yes-no kinds of questions or seek to get yes-no kinds of answers. You're going to look at what, why, who, when, where, or how. But they will not be closed-ended questions that can be answered with a yes or no. They're going to be open-ended questions that are designed to get you a large volume of data. You're not going to use numerical sources. You're going to use non-numerical sources, things like observations, documents, interviews, focus groups, journals. There are any number of them, but they are not going to be numerical sources. Or If you do, by chance, use something that yields numerical data, you're not going to do a statistical analysis of it. You're going to talk about it descriptively. So you can have some quantitative data, but it will be analyzed descriptively. So there's the distinct difference. And if you look at it from an epistemological perspective, the idea of positivism, the idea of yes, no, and using numbers to identify a yes, no with variables that are very concrete versus the idea of post-positivism, looking at things humanistically, that people are different, that they have different reactions and responses and learning patterns, and that we must take all of those into account. You can see how those two frameworks would be very different. One tests a theory or a hypothesis, the other creates a lens that shows us how you're going to approach a study. Well, what does that mean in a little more detail? You're going to identify the specific framework, what's going to go into it, as you read your literature. You're going to identify the key concepts related to the gaps that you identify in your research of the literature that's out there, peer reviews of literature. You're going to develop from that questions that you want to answer and how you approach those questions. And that's going to be evolved as you identify the key concepts related to the information presented surrounding that gap. Now, there may not be a lot out there, but there will be something to which you can relate. And we'll talk a little bit about some examples so that you can get a better idea of what those might be shortly. A theoretical framework, as I mentioned earlier, is related to a positivist epistemology and the identification of quantitative answers, yes or no answers. So a theoretical framework, because it's in that bailiwick, that area of the research landscape, okay, for lack of a better word right off the top of my head, the research landscape is going to focus on a key theory, a key development, or a couple of developments that you want to test beyond an initial theory that has been evolved. So essentially what you're going to be doing in that theoretical framework is identifying the undergirding for whatever you are testing. If you're going to be testing something. So what does that mean? You're going to have something that is in a state of unsurety in relation to what you're examining, that you can identify a confirmation or disconfirmation of. You'll have some hypothesis based on some aspect of current research. You'll have perhaps something that is a hypothesis tested to the point of theory. You'll have perhaps a conclusion that you are drawing that you want to test in relation to something that's presented in the research literature based on that research literature so that you have a justification for it. And in parallel, you'll have, as you put together your research questions, a hypothesis and null hypothesis, an alternate and a null, to parallel the research questions and to fit with your theoretical framework, but not necessarily to match your theoretical framework. Okay, so let's talk about what those ideas all mean. One of the hardest parts in identifying a theoretical framework is understanding the definition of theory. In common language, we all talk about having a theory for this and a theory for that. I have a theory about why the sun comes up in the morning. I have a theory about why the sun sets. It may not be the scientific theory. I might be believing that because I go out and throw seeds at the ground one night, the next morning, I'm going to see the sun rise. Theories that we have, that we hold as our personal bias or our personal perspective, are not the classical theories that we think of in research. In research, a classical definition of a theory is a hypothesis that has been tested and retested enough to be accepted as principle until it is disproven. So it's never completely proven, but it's been proven to a point, or it's been accepted to a point, tested to a point, confirmed to a point that we call it a theory. A theoretical framework then can use a theory in the classic definition, or it can use hypotheses that are on the way to being theories, or it can use conclusions that you draw that you want to test as potential hypotheses. The goal is to test the validity of a theory, of a conclusion, of a hypothesis, to see whether or not it's confirmed in a specific situation in relation to specific variables, et cetera, et cetera. That said, let's talk about what a theoretical framework might look like. I've got two examples here to kind of give you an idea of how you might put a theoretical framework together. So let's say that we're going to build on the theory of the Fab Five, which is the 5 free reading skills required for children to develop optimal reading abilities. And they are phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. Normally acquired by 3rd grade so that students can learn to read effectively from 3rd grade on. To expand on that, though, using that as the basis of the framework, we could look at a study that examines the relationship between the development of the Fab Five and its impact on ESL students' learning of reading English in 5th grade, for example. So we would use the theoretical framework of the Fab Five, and that Fab Five is a factor directly in the research that's done. We could look again at using the theoretical framework of the Fab Five and do a study on what would be the difference between two groups if, for example, one of the groups did not know phonemic awareness while the other group did not know fluency, but they had the others. That would be building on that framework. Or we could use this framework of the Fab Five to see if X program is going to prove effective in making a difference in student scores, teaching vocabulary to students. So we would have one group that did not use X program and the other group that did, and see if there were a difference in the end of year test scores for those two groups in relation to the development of phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, or comprehension. So that's how you might use that as a theoretical framework. Notice how that Fab Five, however, is really closely mirrored in the kinds of questions you would ask. So theoretical frameworks can look like that, or they can look like this one. Using the theory of connectivism, the idea that learning can occur in connected ways, not necessarily in traditional environments, but through the use of the internet and any other number of resources, you could expand on that idea to study the relationship between the use of iPads and cell phones in high school student learning and the student grades at the end of the year in specific courses. Notice that connectivism is really never discussed in the expansion, in the explanation of what the study is, questions are, or the study purpose is, but that it undergirds it, that without the idea of connectivism, there isn't really a basis for building on that to look at the relationship between the use of iPads and cell phones in high school and what that might mean to students' grades. So again, you can have a theoretical framework that isn't directly mirrored in the questions that are being asked, but that undergirds it. So those are two applications or two examples of what a theoretical framework can look like. Notice that they're both testing the application, however, of a theory or the application of a hypothesis, if you were using a hypothesis instead, or a conclusion that you drew based on some other kind of research that was highly researched, that was highly supported by other literature. How do you choose? You make a list of all the relevant theories and ideas you've examined. You consider what the gap is related to. Ultimately, what does each of these potential theories or ideas mean to what you're going to test? How does it relate? Remember, this is about testing a relationship between two or more variables. So you want to make sure that your theoretical framework justifies that testing. A conceptual framework is a different kind of animal because, again, this fits the epistemology of post-positivism, humanism, the idea that people are different. So we're not going to look for something that we can test with a yes or no kind of confirmation. Instead, we're going to look at something that helps us to understand how we look more comprehensively at the topics that we're examining in qualitative or mixed method study. So I always think of it as a spider web. It helps to undergird, to support the approach that you're taking by helping us to understand how different pieces of knowledge out there guide the approach that you're taking. I want to mention here that it is used in mixed methods because even if you're doing a segment that tests using statistical analysis, you're still going to be using a segment that recognizes the differences between people. So rather than have two frameworks, something that is not accepted in research as a standard, you have one framework. And that's going to be your conceptual framework to help us understand why you're going to approach the study the way you do, ultimately to test that qualitative piece. I've got several definitions here of a conceptual framework because basically people will talk about it in a little bit different ways. But I want to draw your attention to the bottom definition here, and these are all drawn from, again, the book that's used in Research 8110, that first research course that talks about theory and design, written by Burkholder, Cox, and Crawford. This definition by Marshall and Rossman comes close to what I want to talk about in terms of helping you understand a conceptual framework. It is the idea of using peer-reviewed rationales to link research questions to research and theoretical constructs. Well, what does that really mean? Okay, that means that you're going to take the peer-reviewed research and you're going to identify which pieces of it will help us understand why you're going to number one, ask the research questions that you're asking, and number two, approach the study as you are. Remember that there are philosophical perspectives you can use as a part of your framework, and there are experiential. And those pieces can make a difference in how you approach it. For example, if you're looking at something dealing with women not being heard, you want to hear their voices, you might include something that talks about feminist theory. Okay? The reason I mention this is because you can have theory in a conceptual framework, but that will not be all. If you do have a theory and you do not necessarily have to have a theory, it can be based just on research literature. So let's talk about this first example of a conceptual framework and see if I can help you to understand what I'm trying to say. So in the research literature, we identify that research indicates connectivism. Again, the idea that people learn in different ways through connected media, through connected ideas, through connecting information from sources that are not traditional learning sources. That idea that connectivism allows people to pull lots of sources together for learning. Other research indicates that high school students use technology for information, technology being an important part of the idea of connected learning. Further research indicates that high school students have trouble discerning between quality information and quote-unquote fake news, something that's been noted highly and discussed highly in the media today. So the research question, you might evolve a framework using these three different pieces of research literature might be something like, how do students determine which information to use and which information to ignore when they are studying a given topic? And you could go in and do a study talking to students, trying to identify how they determine which pieces to use. Ask them a series of questions, do interviews, do focus groups, that kind of thing. So those three pieces of information are things that you could use to build your framework. Now, you could include there the theory of connectivism because connectivism is appropriate given that the first article that you're talking about, or the first piece of research, talks about connectivism. So you could build that theory in, but you wouldn't necessarily have to include that theory. You could be discussing the idea of connectivism from a research article, and that would be acceptable too. The second framework I want to talk about deals with the idea of autism as an example. And this is going to be a little bit different because there isn't really a theory from which you're building here, okay? These are all based on research, literature. And the approach, the study that you're going to use is going to be a little bit different. But you'll see that these pieces of information are drawn and present the approach that you're going to take. Autism students have challenges related to interacting with others. Autism students learn well from interacting with others in structured play, and autism students learn well from specific instruction on how to interact with others. Okay, so we start out with the idea that they have challenges related to interacting with others, and then we learn a little bit more about different aspects of how they can overcome that challenge. So your study could be focused on what the strengths and weaknesses are of the Educate Our Children program, which focuses on teaching children how to interact with each other. Now, that Educate Our Children program doesn't really exist, but you get the idea. Your sub-questions then could be things like, what do teachers believe about it? What do parents believe about it? And what improvements do students show when this is used? Notice that there isn't really a theory built into this, and that this is drawn from the research literature to undergird the approach that you're taking to your study. So that's what a conceptual framework can look like. Note also that a conceptual framework does not test. There is no testing here. There is only probing, okay? So that's the nature of a conceptual framework. A summary of conceptual framework, remember that you're going to use peer-reviewed sources. You can have a theory, but you don't have to. You're going to create a justification or a rationale for the approach to a study you're going to do. You can include in there a philosophical theory. You can include in that an experiential theory. Those that I mentioned are some examples earlier. If they're appropriate, if, for example, you were looking at autistic children who were females, you might build into it feminist theory if that was appropriate based on the research. It might not be, it might be. You need to look at it and see. But you can have multiple aspects to kind of tell us why you're steering in the direction that you're steering as you conduct your study. The essential components of any framework are theory and peer-reviewed resources. Theory or hypothesis or conclusion for a quantitative study, theory maybe, and peer-reviewed resources or just peer-reviewed resources for your qualitative conceptual framework. You're going to see any framework connect your research to your research questions, your problem, purpose, and questions all fit together with your design. They're going to connect you to how you approach your study and why your study is important. You want to make sure that you can justify why these resources work and that you discuss that in Chapter 1 when you discuss your framework, and then in Chapter 2 as you discuss your framework and how it evolved or why it evolved through discussion of the different sources that went into it, the different kinds of peer-reviewed perspectives that you're going to present in justification, that as you do that, you explain it and connect that then to what you present in Chapter 1 so that everything flows. Chapter 2 gives us a greater insight into your framework, and Chapter 1 gives us a summary, the specifics, the nitty-gritty. But remember always that what you're doing is thinking epistemologically, not using epistemology, but thinking epistemologically. Quantitative studies test yes or no because they're positivist. And a theoretical framework that is being tested is what you use with a quantitative study that looks at positivism and tests for yes or no. Conceptual frameworks are based on post-positivism, the idea that people are different and that their humanist sides must be examined. It is a conceptual framework because it puts together different aspects of research to help us understand which aspects you feel are most important to understand the approach you're going to use to fill the research gap. So the post-positivist purpose is really to help us understand which pieces, which aspects of individual development or circumstances, situations, phenomena are most important for us to understand the approach you're going to take and the information you're going to try to acquire. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'm here to help, and I will be happy to do anything I can to assist you. Again, my name is Paula DeWitowitz. My email address is on the first slide. I put here a list of references that you can use to really understand everything from framework to epistemology and how those pieces fit together. Please take a second, and if it's of any interest to you, freeze the screen here so that you can write down whatever you think is interesting. I also have a set of dissertations that have good examples of frameworks. And I'm not saying the rest of the study is good or the presentation is good, but I am saying that the frameworks for these are good. So I'll pause here so you can take a look at these. And if there's anything of interest, again, freeze the screen and write down whatever will be useful to you. Here are some sample articles, and I have several slides of these. I will again scroll through relatively slowly. So if anything jumps out at you, you have a chance to look at it. I tried to pull ideas from a number of different perspectives so that you could see things from health to education to health education to business education, so that whatever the permutations of your study design might be in relation to an aspect of the educational process, you would be able to look at something that would be related. And again, there are several of these, so I'm just going to scroll through slowly. So the point that I want to make with all of this is that framework, although many people will think of it as something that's just slapped together, in the perspective stage, it is a little bit more amorphous. It's not really fully designed because you don't really know yet what your gap is. You have an idea of what it is, but you don't know for certain. When you develop your proposal, your gap should be very solidified. You should know exactly what gap you're going after. And so your framework should be very exact. You want to think exact, succinct, explaining your approach, clear so that we can understand how your research problem and purpose fit together with your questions and the design that you choose and how you're going to execute that design. All of these pieces are very important, and the framework is what gives us that part of the metaphorical bridge from research problem to research design, pulling those pieces at the beginning, the problem, purpose, and questions, together with the design at the end. And without a good, solid framework, you might drive your car out on that metaphoric bridge and fall through the hole that exists because there isn't anything there, or fall through the rickety part that is a poorly designed framework. And remember that a framework that is not solid can also result in a design that is unclear, that it's scattered, that doesn't make sense. So you want to make sure you do a really good job in pulling together the framework as you conduct your study. Again, if you have any other questions, please contact me. I hope this has been useful, and I look forward to talking to you in the future. Thank you. Bye.